So, my name is James. I work for the church. I do some speaking. I haven't done any preaching for a while, so some of you may have forgotten what it's like to see me up here, but I'm here again. I'm back, and just in time to start a new series on 1 Samuel. We're going to be pulling bits and pieces from the book as we go through this series, and I'm starting with the first couple of chapters, Samuel 1, 2. We're just going to look at the verses that Aoife read today, the beginning of the story. It's a book full of stories that some of you will be familiar with, so you might sort of know a lot about what we're going to be talking about. But we're going to start with this sort of opening story here about Hannah and what happens with her. What we have here is, when you read a book like this, it might feel a bit like from another planet in a way, because it's something that happened a long time ago in another country, and you've got a guy who's got 2 wives, which isn't something that happens in this country very often, as far as I know. They go to temple, they make sacrifices. These kind of things might seem a bit foreign to some of us. They're not sort of normal experiences we have in our life. But what this story is really about, I think, particularly what you see in this opening sort of 20 verses, is it's really about a family, a kind of a bit of a dysfunctional family with some slight problems, some slight issues, and there are relationship things going on here. Things that I think maybe we can identify with, things that are familiar to us. Elkanah has 2 wives, Peninnah and Hannah. Obviously likes wives whose name ends the same as his. Elkanah, Peninnah, Hannah. Hannah, we're told he loves Hannah more. And he doesn't hide this fact. He gives her more, he shows her more affection. But Hannah can't give him children, and Peninnah can. That's what she has. She's not as loved, but she can at least give him children. So out of her jealousy, out of her bitterness, she mocks Hannah, who the passage describes as her rival for her husband's affection. Now, do you kind of know this kind of relationship? Do you know this kind of interaction? Maybe you have people, your friends or your family, who you know who build themselves up by knocking others down. Maybe you are that sort of person. Maybe you've got a kind of jealousy or a bitterness or a resentment in your heart, and you know people, and maybe when you hear that someone is struggling or having a bit of a difficult time, there's something in you that's secretly a little bit pleased. Maybe you are that sort of person, or you know what that's like to be treated like that. It can be difficult to admit that we're people like that, but maybe some of us are. Your secret is safe with me. I won't tell anyone. But she goes to her husband, Elkanah, who you'd expect to support her, to understand her. But even he, I think, doesn't understand her struggles, doesn't take her seriously. His response to her sadness is he almost takes it personally. Why don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Why are you so sad? Why don't you just cheer up? Is your life really that bad? He doesn't understand the depth of her hurt and her pain and her struggles. Again, maybe you know people like that. You've got people like that in your family who almost seem to be offended when you're struggling, when you're upset. Like they take it personally, as though your sadness is a comment on them. Maybe that's something you struggle with. You struggle with not being like the center of attention. And when people are feeling sorry for someone else, you say, well, what about me? What's going on there? Well, Hannah, we read, is in the temple, and she begins to pray. And she's bringing her sadness and her bitterness to God. And Eli, the priest, sees her and misunderstands what's going on. Even Eli, the priest, doesn't understand Hannah, doesn't understand her pain. He thinks she's drunk. How can you be in the temple of God and be drunk? This is disgraceful. This must have been quite embarrassing for Hannah, I think, probably in this moment. She's just praying, and the priest sort of shames her in public. Has that ever happened to you? In a church, have you ever been to a church and been sort of publicly shamed? You go to church, you just want to meet God, you just want to bring your heart to God, and someone misunderstands you and kind of embarrasses you. It's happened to me. It's quite an awkward and embarrassing story that I'm about to tell you. But when I was younger, I was sort of 18, I was at university, and I went to a church. And one of the things that happened at this church is, like at Barton, you could be prayed for after the service. People would pray for you if you wanted it. And that hadn't happened in the church that I came from. So this was new to me, and I tried it, and people prayed for me, and it was amazing. Like, it was great to be prayed for, and people prayed, and God spoke to me in those situations. So I thought, this is great, so I'll keep doing this. And one time after the service, I went to be prayed for by a guy, and I didn't know who he was, and he started praying for me, and it started off fairly standard, and then he went rogue. And he started praying very loudly, publicly, that I would go home and I would burn all my pornography. Now, this wasn't something that I had at home. This was not something that was happening in my life. And this guy I don't know what happened. I feel like he must have taken a look at me, a young man, and said, pornography, that's probably a safe bet. And prayed that I would go home and burn all my pornography. So I kind of know a bit how Hannah feels, to kind of be publicly embarrassed in a church setting. When you just go there, I just wanted to meet God, and this guy kind of misjudged me. You know, it doesn't feel great. But Hannah she's a lot more noble than me. She had a lot more integrity than me, because I'm very British, and I just smiled, thank you for praying for me, and I went on my way. And I was very reluctant to go forward for prayer the following week. But Hannah says, no, that's not what's happening here. That is not the situation. I'm in pain, I'm struggling, and I'm just pouring out my anguish before the Lord. And then Eli, the priest. Now, I quite like Eli. He's quite a small character in this book. We'll mention him next week. We'll talk about him next week as well. But he's not a perfect guy by any stretch of the imagination. He makes some mistakes, as we will hear, but he's got a good heart. That's what comes through in Eli's story. He's a guy with a good heart. And when he realizes that he has misunderstood Hannah, when he realizes that he's misjudged her and got her wrong, he says, may the Lord grant you what you've been praying. He sort of says, I didn't understand, and may you be blessed instead. And he understands her, and he encourages her, and he lifts her up when he realizes that he was wrong. And we read that something changes in Hannah. She's no longer discouraged, she's lifted up. You know, sometimes that's all it takes. Your situation doesn't have to change, just someone needs to come alongside you and take you seriously. That's all that needs to happen sometimes. During World War II, Britain had been fighting with her Commonwealth allies, kind of a long war against Germany. And Britain as a nation, we've not got a huge population. We faced a manpower shortage towards the end of the war. And it wasn't just the armed forces that were sort of struggling to keep up the numbers. It was also the coal mining here in this country. We needed coal to keep fighting the war, and struggling to get coal miners. So I don't know if you knew this, but towards the end of the Second World War, when young men were drafted into the service, they were also sometimes drafted into the coal mines. You didn't necessarily end up being in the army, the air force, or the navy. Sometimes you'd be drafted into the coal mines. But it was really difficult to keep the morale of the coal miners up, because it was hard, thankless work, and there wasn't much glory in it. There wasn't much, you weren't going to win a medal if you were working in the coal mines, and sort of other young men were going off to fight, and others were being sent to the coal mines, and morale was hard to keep up. And there was an incident where Winston Churchill went to give a speech to thousands of coal miners to try and lift their spirits and encourage them. And he did this for them by painting a mental picture for them. He said, well, what I want you to do is I want you to picture, when the war is finally won, I want you to picture a grand parade that's going to take place. And he said, first will come the sailors of the Royal Navy, the ones who'd upheld the grand tradition of Trafalgar and the defeat of the Armada. And he said, next would come the pilots of the Royal Air Force, who, more than any, kept this island safe during the early days of World War II. And he said, finally will come the army who stood tall at the crisis of Dunkirk and won the battles in North Africa. And he said, finally, last of all, would come a long line of sweat-stained, soot-streaked men in miners' caps. And he said, someone would cry out from the crowd, and where were you during the critical days of the struggle? And Churchill said, 10,000 voices would reply, we were deep in the earth with our faces to the coal. And the newspaper report said there were men crying as they heard this, just because a man who they respected, someone they looked up to, had taken them seriously, had acknowledged their struggle, their sacrifice. Sometimes that's all it takes. That's all it takes. Hannah's situation hasn't changed. She's still in the same position, but she's been built up. Can you be that sort of person? Can you do that for someone else? Can you put aside your own insecurities, your own jealousies, your own pains for a moment, just to come along someone else who's struggling and say, may the God of Israel grant you what you've asked of him? Can you be that sort of person? I think you can. I know you can do that. But there's someone else in the story, someone else who comes alongside Hannah, someone else who takes her seriously, someone else who acknowledges her pain. And of course, it's God. It's God whose fingerprints are all through the Bible. And in this story, we read of a God who understands her in a way perhaps her family doesn't. And that's quite a nice thought, isn't it? It'd be quite a nice way to end the sermon, wouldn't it? You know, even when no one understands you, God does. Even when no one takes you seriously, God does. And that's not a bad thought to leave here with. But there's something else going on here. There's something else I really want to talk about. Because we're told, something does change for Hannah after this prayer. We're told at the beginning of the story, she can't have children because God has closed her womb. Whatever that means, however you want to understand that. And I'm sure this is not the first time she's prayed about this. I'm sure this is not the first time she's brought this to God. And yet something happens here that causes God to hear her prayer, to answer, to not forget her, as it says, to remember her. There is, for me, a statement that comes to mind, a phrase that I heard for the first time a few years ago in this church. I had just preached a sermon and I was talking to someone about it afterwards, and they said something, a phrase, a statement that they thought summed up what I'd been trying to say, and I thought, fantastic, it's a fantastic phrase, a fantastic statement. And I just filed it away, as I often do, to bring out and take the credit for at a later date. But then earlier this year, I was talking to a friend in Australia by email, and he said to me, my dad told me something once, and he repeated the exact same phrase, the exact same statement. And I thought, that's interesting. That's interesting. And then I was preparing this sermon. Actually, I haven't preached for a while, but what you may not know is that I'm actually preaching for this week and the next 3 weeks. So you've got, did someone say yes? What? That's all right, clear your diaries. Well, thank you for the encouragement. So you've got a block of me, and so what I've been doing is I've been preparing the sort of next 4 sermons in a row. It's kind of almost sort of thinking about them as a mini series, if you like, even though I'm only doing the first half of the book of Samuel. And when I was preparing this sermon, and when I've been thinking about the next passages, because I've been able, because we've done it this way, to think about them all together at the same time. And this phrase, you want to know what this phrase is now, don't you? Well, this kept coming up. And this seemed to me like the kind of thing I wanted to use as a theme, not just for this sermon, but for the next few sermons, an idea that I want us to keep coming back to. And I'm now going to tell you what it is. The idea is this, the theme is this. If you take God seriously, he will take you seriously. That's the theme. This is the idea I want us to come back to over the next few weeks. If you take God seriously, he will take you seriously. You see, there's something different about Hannah in the moment she prays here. The way she prays, it almost sounds like she's trying to make a bargain with God. Is that how it reads to you? If you give me what I want, God, I'll give you something back. If you give me a son, I'll give him to you. Maybe you pray like that. Maybe you just stop and think for a moment about what we do when we do that, when we think we can try and manipulate God. Do we try to do that? Maybe we do. Maybe we try and pray that way, trying to figure out how we can manipulate God to give us what we want. But this doesn't feel like she's trying to manipulate God. This doesn't feel like she's trying to make a deal with God, for one thing, because God answers her prayer. So he obviously doesn't feel like he's being manipulated or taken advantage of. There's something actually that Hannah does here that I think is important, because what's she asking for? She's asking for a son. And then what does she say she's going to do with this son? Give him away. Straight away. It's not really a great deal she's making with God, is it? She doesn't really get anything out of it at the end of it. She's lost the thing she's asking for. I think God responds to Hannah's prayer. He responds to what Hannah asked for, because he sees in this moment that Hannah is taking him seriously. God, give me what I ask for so I can give it straight back to you. If you take God seriously, he'll take you seriously. See, my prayers are not often along these lines. I don't know about you, but my prayers are much more along the lines of, God, here's what I want you to do for me. This is what I want now. This is what I need now. Give me this, give me that, pay my bills, make the sun shine. I demand a better future. Then along comes someone who prays, what I really want in this moment, God, is to give you a gift. What does it take to pray like that? I'm reminded of what James says in chapter 4 of his letter. He's writing to the church and he says, you wonder why your prayers aren't answered. I'll tell you why your prayers aren't answered. Because you pray with selfish motives, asking for things only so that you can spend what you get on yourselves. And along comes Hannah, who is not overly concerned with sort of making a net gain, but what this means for God in the moment, for his work, for his honor. She takes God seriously in this moment, not as a vending machine. Sometimes I think prayer can almost feel like we come up against an ATM. We can sometimes think, if I can just work out the PIN number for this ATM, all this money will come flowing out. And we think this is what prayer is. That we just need to work out the PIN number and God will sort of reward us with prayer. That's not taking God seriously, is it? And if we come to God not taking him seriously in prayer, why should he take us seriously? Why should we expect him to take us seriously? But if you take God seriously, you get his attention. So that's where we're going in this series. This, at least the first part of this series. If you take God seriously, he will take you seriously. And we're going to think about over the weeks, what does that look like in the first part of the book the first part of 1 Samuel. What does it look like to take God seriously? How do characters take God seriously or not in the passages that we read? And I think Hannah gives us an example of how to begin with a shift of perspective. God does not exist purely for our benefit. I think sometimes this is our relationship with God. We think, God, you exist for my benefit. You exist to make my business easier. But the reality is, God is not about our business. We should be about his business. And maybe the way we pray should reflect that. Maybe the way we pray should reflect that. Maybe our thinking should reflect that. Maybe our first question is not, are people listening to me? Are people taking me seriously? But it's, am I listening to God? Am I taking God seriously? Maybe that's where we start. So this is where we land today. This is where we're going to be going in the coming weeks. A journey of what it means to take God seriously and the amazing things that he does when we do. It might be challenging. I'm kind of hoping it will be challenging for us to think about what it means to take God seriously. But I also hope it's going to be exciting. I hope it's going to be exciting. And I hope it's going to be a way for us to experience growth in our relationship with God, something for us to look forward to, because there's something else that happens here with Hannah. She prays for God, give me a son, I'll give him to you, to your service. And God says, here's your son. And then you know what God says next? Oh, hang on, I haven't finished. Here's another child. And 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 Hannah has 5 more children. Because here's something really important to remember. Because I think this is absolutely thrilling to remember. That if you take God seriously, he takes you seriously. And that includes something he takes very seriously, which is how to bless you.